I'm a retired detective now, living a quieter life than I ever thought possible. Most days I spend my time fixing up this old house in Pennsylvania. It's got more creaks than my knees do, but it's keeping me busy. Still, some nights, when the wind howls just right and the dark presses in, I swear I can hear the crackle of the dispatch in my head again. It's like I never really left 1989. Back then, I was just a rookie, green enough to glow. I got paired with Linda Hall, the seasoned detective who'd been solving cases nobody else could. She was tough, no nonsense, with eyes that had seen more than she'd ever let on. When the call came in, a teenager murdered in a small, tight-knit town, I thought, this is it. This is where I prove myself. Linda was like a mother to me, the stern type that never coddled but always had your back. My own family barely saw me. My wife and I were new parents, but I was missing out on bedtime stories and late-night cries. Linda had a family too, her eldest just off to college, and we both leaned on each other. It wasn't just the long hours. It was the way that case started eating us alive. We picked up a suspect named Carl Owens, local guy with a crooked smile and eyes that looked right through you. Everything pointed at Carl. The blood, the fingerprints, even his own confession. But something about him didn't sit right. He was too calm, too amused. He smiled through every interrogation like he knew the punchline to a joke we didn't even know we were part of. "Don't sweat it," Linda told me, but the way her eyes darted to the floor said otherwise. We were supposed to be in control, but I felt like a fly walking right into a spider's web. My wife said I was changing, said I'd just stare off into space, mumbling about Carl, about the case. She was right, of course. I was there in body, but my mind was always in that room, staring across the table at Carl's goddamn grin. Linda and I dug deeper. We found out this wasn't Carl's first time. Back in '73, there was another murder, same town, same details, and wouldn't you know it, Carl had walked free. Same grin, same courtroom smirk. It felt like we were dealing with something far bigger than just one man. Linda pushed us to go off book. She wanted to interrogate the victim's family without clearance. "Sometimes you gotta bend the rules to get to the truth," she said. I followed, even though every bone in my body screamed at me to stop. Nights were spent in the precinct, old records spread across the desk, coffee cups piling up. Linda got jumpy, chain-smoking like a chimney, her eyes getting that haunted look. One night, we got a tip from an old friend of Linda's, a retired officer who'd known her late husband. He gave us a lead, an abandoned farmhouse just outside town. Rumor had it that Carl spent time there as a kid. Linda didn't hesitate. We grabbed our gear and drove out in the dead of night. It was the kind of night where everything feels alive. Crickets, owls, even the wind sounded like it was whispering secrets. The farmhouse was a wreck. Windows busted, roof sagging. The whole place smelled like rot. Linda kicked the door in, and we swept the place. It was empty, but there were signs someone had been there. Cigarette butts, a couple of empty cans, and a single joker card pinned to the wall with a knife. Linda and I shared a look. We knew we were close, and it felt like Carl was taunting us. The next day, we brought in forensics, but the chief caught wind of our little escapade. He ripped into us, threatened to pull us off the case. "You're both loose cannons," he said, spit flying as he yelled. Linda just stared him down, and when he left, she muttered, "We're getting too close, and they don't like it." The tension got worse. Carl's lawyer kept blocking us. Injunctions, complaints, even personal threats. Then things got violent. One night while I was coming home, I saw a shadow move by my front door. I rushed up, gun drawn, but it was too late. My dog was dead, a note pinned to his collar. "Back off!" My heart pounded, rage and fear mixing in my veins. I called Linda and she was quiet for a long moment. "They're scared of us," she finally said. "That means we're close." We kept pushing. We found out that Carl had been protected. Somehow he was untouchable. Turns out Carl wasn't just some guy. He was a confidential informant working for Linda's late husband, who died on duty. Linda unraveled after that. She blamed herself, said her husband had made a deal with the devil, and now we were paying the price. She started drinking, and I couldn't stop her. A few days later, we got another lead, a storage unit rented under a fake name. Linda and I went out there, armed and ready. Inside, we found boxes of old files, pictures, even trophies. Evidence from the murders in '73 and from our current case. It was like a shrine to Carl's twisted legacy. Then we heard it, a car pulling up outside. Linda motioned for me to stay quiet, and we killed the lights. We watched from the shadows as Carl walked in, that same smug grin on his face. Linda didn't wait. She stepped out, gun raised. "Freeze, Carl!" she shouted. But Carl didn't flinch. He just smiled wider. "You think you can stop this?" he said, almost laughing. I moved to back her up, but before I could react, the door slammed open and 2 more men came in. Big guys, armed. Everything happened so fast. Shots were fired, and I hit the ground, crawling behind a stack of boxes. Linda was hit. She went down hard, but she still fired back, catching one of the men in the leg. I got to my feet, aiming at Carl, but he was already running. I chased him out into the night, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. He darted into the woods, and I followed, branches slapping my face, my breath coming in gasps. I could hear him laughing, that same damn laugh, echoing through the trees. I lost him. By the time I got back to the storage unit, Linda was barely conscious. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "Don't let him win," she whispered, her hand gripping mine before it went slack. I called for backup, but it was too late. Linda was gone. The official report called it a botched operation. They said Linda acted recklessly, that we both did. Carl disappeared after that. No trace, no leads, just gone. The chief suspended me, said I was a liability. I knew they were just trying to sweep it all under the rug. I left the force soon after. Couldn't take it anymore. My wife and I patched things up, slowly. I spent my days fixing the house, trying to forget. But Carl's grin, Linda's haunted eyes, they're always there, just out of reach. I get letters sometimes. Folks from that town, some thanking me, others accusing me of letting a monster walk free. And sometimes late at night, when the wind's just right, I swear I see him, standing in the shadows, that grin just waiting. Maybe one day I'll open the case again, not for justice. Justice is a lie we tell ourselves, but for answers, for Linda. As I write this, my porch light flickers, and there, in the dark, I swear I see him, just standing, smiling, like he knows something I don't. Story 2. I'm Aaron Matthews, a former journalist who covered crime in the late 80s. These days I'm teaching media ethics at a local college. Yeah, it's ironic. I spend my time telling bright-eyed kids to stick to their morals, even though I walked away from mine a long time ago. It all started in 1989 with the Butler Creek murders, a story that should have been my big break but ended up tearing my life apart instead. Back then I was a young reporter hungry for the headlines. When I heard about 2 detectives getting killed while working a decades-old cold case, I thought it was my ticket to fame. Detective Mark Thatcher and Detective Sandra Ross, they were legends at the precinct, known for cracking the impossible cases. I had covered a few stories with them before, got close enough that Mark would meet me in dingy diners for late-night interviews. He'd always order the greasiest thing on the menu and laugh that it kept him grounded. The detectives had reopened the murder of Frank Chambers, a factory worker killed in '67. On paper, it was a dead-end case. But off the record, Mark told me about whispers of corruption, payoffs, and a cover-up that stretched for years. I remember getting the call from him late one night. His voice was shaky, paranoid. He said they'd found something big, evidence that would blow the case open. He asked me to come to his house instead of the station. That alone should have set off alarms in my head. When I told my wife I was going to meet Mark, she looked at me like I was an idiot. "Aaron, you're not a cop," she said. "You write about danger. You don't live it." She was right, but I didn't listen. I never did. Mark's place was dark when I got there, just a single lamp on in the living room. He looked rough, bags under his eyes, shirt wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for days. He showed me a photo, a grainy shot of a ledger page. It listed payouts, cops, judges, even reporters, all tied to the factory where Chambers worked. And there, scrawled in the margins, was a date, September 14th, 1989. The day before Mark and Sandra were found dead. My stomach dropped. I knew I was in over my head, but I couldn't walk away. I started digging. Old articles, public records, anything that could give me context. Meanwhile, Mark and Sandra were falling apart. Mark stopped returning my calls. Sandra's car was found abandoned near the woods, bloodstains on the passenger seat. The official line was that it was unrelated, but come on, I knew better. The deeper I got, the worse it looked. The factory had been tied to mob money, shady contracts, and half the original case files were missing. I found out Mark had been subpoenaed for a closed-door inquiry about police misconduct. Sandra wasn't on the witness list, but her name popped up in a leaked transcript, connected to payouts from that damned factory ledger. And just like that, the narrative changed. Suddenly, Mark and Sandra weren't just victims. They were suspects. The precinct painted them as dirty cops who got in too deep, and their deaths were ruled a murder-suicide. Case closed. But it didn't add up. Mark's widow swore he'd been framed, and I believed her. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a murderer. I knew I had to do something, so I decided to publish the ledger. My editor shot me down, said it was career suicide, so I leaked it anonymously. It worked. The fallout was immediate. Indictments, scandals, the whole 9 yards, but it also painted a target on my back. One night, I found my car torched. Nothing left but a charred skeleton, and then the threats started. Calls in the middle of the night, letters slipped under my door. And then, one morning, a photograph. Mark and Sandra, alive, but bound and gagged. The timestamp showed it was taken 2 days after they were supposedly killed. I followed the lead to a storage unit, rented under Sandra's name. I had to sneak in. It was after hours, and I knew if anyone spotted me, it would be the end of this. Inside, there were boxes of files, photos, documents, tapes, evidence that proved Mark and Sandra weren't dirty, that they were trying to blow the whistle on something bigger than anyone realized. And then I heard footsteps. I barely had time to hide before 2 guys came in, armed. I watched from between the boxes as they looked around, one of them muttering, "Boss wants this place clean. No loose ends." They doused the place in gasoline and set it ablaze. I barely got out, coughing and wheezing, my hands empty. Everything was gone. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I moved from motel to motel, always looking over my shoulder. The official story never changed. Mark and Sandra, dirty cops who got what was coming to them. I tried to tell the truth, but no one wanted to hear it. The precinct, the press, even my own editor, they all wanted it buried. One night, I was cornered outside a diner by a couple of guys in suits. They didn't say much, just a warning to stay out of things that didn't concern me. One of them pulled out a knife, ran it across my arm, just enough to draw blood. "Next time, it'll be deeper," he said, his voice calm, like he was talking about the weather. I knew then that I was in real danger. I needed to disappear. I quit journalism after that, couldn't stomach it anymore. My wife and I drifted apart, though she still sends Christmas cards. I took a teaching gig, trying to convince students not to make the same mistakes I did, but I couldn't let it go completely. I kept a copy of the ledger, though, hidden in my office, under a loose floorboard. Sometimes, I still get those calls with no one on the other end. Sometimes I think about reopening the case, not for justice, but for answers. Maybe for Mark, maybe for Sandra, maybe just for me. Then there was the night someone broke into my house. I came back from a late lecture to find the place trashed, drawers pulled out, papers everywhere. They were looking for something. I checked the floorboard. The ledger was still there, but there was something else. Another photograph, tucked under the ledger. Mark and Sandra again, this time in a car looking terrified. The timestamp was recent, just a week old. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I reached out to an old contact, someone who'd worked with Mark back in the day. He agreed to meet, but only if I came alone. The rendezvous point was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I knew it was a trap, but I didn't have a choice. I needed answers. The warehouse was dark, the air thick with dust. I heard a noise, a shuffle, a cough. My contact stepped out of the shadows, his face lined with worry. "Aaron, you shouldn't be here," he said. Before I could respond, the doors burst open, and half a dozen men rushed in. They grabbed my contact, dragging him away while he screamed, They know everything!" I tried to fight, but someone hit me from behind, and everything went black. When I came to, I was in my car, parked outside my house. My head was pounding, and there was a note on the dashboard. "Last warning. Stay out." I stumbled inside, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. I knew then that I was never going to be free of this. They would always be watching, waiting for me to slip up. Last week I got a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Mark and Sandra smiling. The timestamp was from yesterday, and now as I sit here, the phone rings again. I think I'm finally ready to pick it up. Story 3. My name's Eric Langston. I'm a private investigator now, but in 1989 I was a cop with the Hillside PD. These days I work small-time cases, cheating spouses, insurance fraud, but there's one case I'll never touch again, the one that made me quit the force. Back in '89, 2 senior detectives, Joe Carter and Paul Strickland, took me under their wing. We were chasing the murderer of a teenage girl, Emily Norton. They said it was an open and shut case, just a scumbag drifter passing through town. But nothing about that case felt right. Joe was the father I never had. Steady, reliable, always looking out for me. Paul, on the other hand, was like an older brother, constantly pushing me to toughen up. They were inseparable, partners for over a decade, and I trusted them with my life. The case seemed straightforward until Emily's autopsy revealed something strange. She died of a sedative overdose, not the injuries at the scene. Joe and Paul dismissed it, but I couldn't let it go. When I started asking questions, they warned me to back off. I remember feeling torn. Part of me wanted to trust them, but something about their reaction was off. Joe wouldn't even look me in the eye, and Paul snapped at me like I'd crossed some unspoken line. My fiancée, Claire, noticed my unease. She told me to trust my gut, but I didn't want to believe Joe or Paul could be hiding something. I told her to drop it, but the argument stuck with me. Emily's father, Arthur Norton, was a prominent businessman with deep ties to the town's elite. He funded half the precinct's budget. There were whispers about him, but no one dared to dig too deep. When Joe and Paul closed the case after arresting a drifter named Sam Tate, I decided to investigate on my own. I didn't tell anyone, not Claire, not my coworkers. If I was wrong, I'd look like a fool. If I was right, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I started by re-interviewing Emily's friends and family. Most of them repeated what they'd told the detectives, but one friend, Lisa, slipped up. She mentioned seeing Emily arguing with a man in a black car the night she disappeared, a detail never included in the reports. Claire started noticing my absence. She accused me of being more married to the job than to her. I promised I'd make it up to her, but my promises felt hollow even to me. Joe and Paul found out I'd been snooping. Joe pulled me aside, telling me to let sleeping dogs lie. Paul threatened to report me for insubordination if I kept pushing. One night, I followed Paul to a motel on the edge of town. I saw him meet with Arthur Norton. They didn't notice me, but when Paul left, I broke into the room and found a briefcase full of cash and photos of Emily with Norton. It all clicked. Emily wasn't some random victim. She was involved with Norton, and Joe and Paul were covering it up. The weight of their betrayal hit me like a brick. These were the men I trusted most. I went to Claire, hoping she'd talk me out of doing something stupid. Instead, she pushed me to go to internal affairs. "If you don't do the right thing now, you'll regret it forever," she said. Joe showed up at my house the next morning. He didn't outright confess, but he said something I'll never forget. "There are things you can't unsee, Eric. Let it go, for your sake." That night, I dreamed about my dad. He was a dirty cop, and I spent my whole life trying to be better. Now, I wondered if I was any different. I took the photos and the cash to IA. 2 weeks later, Joe and Paul were suspended, but then things got worse. Claire's car was run off the road. She survived, but barely. Paul ambushed me in my driveway. He didn't deny anything. "You think you're the good guy?" he shouted. "You just destroyed your family for nothing. Norton owns this town. He'll bury you." Joe and Paul resigned, but the case against Norton fell apart. Witnesses recanted, evidence went missing, and the drifter, Sam Tate, was convicted. Joe moved away, but Paul stayed, his eyes following me wherever I went. I left the force and married Claire, but the guilt never left. Every time I look at her scars, I wonder if doing the right thing was worth it. Paul showed up at my office last year. He didn't say anything, just left a file on my desk. Inside was a single photo of Norton laughing with a group of cops. Joe was among them. I work quiet cases now. No more big fish, no more corruption. I live small, trying to stay under the radar. But every now and then, I catch a black car parked down the street. Sometimes I think about going after Norton again. Not for justice, but because I can't let him win. Not completely. Last week, Claire found an envelope in the mail. Inside was a single Polaroid of our family at the park. On the back, in red ink, was a single word: enough.